Okay, it's 12:01, so we'll get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Margaret Mueller. I'm the president and CEO of the Executives Club of Chicago. Thank you all for being here today. Today's conversation is based on the Metropolitan Planning Council's Cost of Segregation study, highlighting their 2-year research and policy initiative that they conducted with the Urban Institute. And today's panel includes some of the city's most notable change makers when it comes to thinking about how we create a more equitable landscape for all Chicagoans. For those of you who are joining us for the first time this season, we're using GoToWebinar as our platform. On the screen now, you'll see a quick how-to slide. If you hover your mouse in the right-hand corner of your screen and click the small orange arrow, the GoToWebinar control panel will open. And then clicking on the small arrows on the panel will allow you to access the handouts, including this information and information about our program today and some upcoming programs, as well as the question button where you can submit your questions for the panel. And should you have any technical questions, just email programs@executivesclub.org and a member of our team will be in touch. And I want to take a moment to thank our presenting sponsor for today's program, Wintrust. Thank you for your support in making this program possible today. And with us today is Cassandra Slade, who's Senior Vice President of Community Impact at Wintrust, who will introduce today's program and moderator. Cassandra, over to you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. It is a privilege to be with you all today on behalf of Wintrust. Wintrust is proud to support the Executives Club of Chicago, and we are pleased to sponsor today's conversation, which features several of the leading voices working with Metropolitan Planning Council. Over the last few years, Metropolitan Planning Council has worked to understand the implications that years of segregation have had on the business and civic sectors in Chicago, and what we as leaders in the business community can do to try and move toward a more equitable city. I'm thrilled to welcome Kendra Freeman, Director of Community Development and Engagement at Metropolitan Planning Council, who will be moderating today's program. A native Chicagoan with more than 20 years of experience in program development and operations, Kendra has held leadership positions in the private and nonprofit sectors with a focus on affordable housing and capacity building, and is the perfect voice to lead today's panel. A reminder to please use the question box on your control panel if you have any questions for today's panelists. Kendra, over to you.
Thanks, Cassandra, and it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today, especially our esteemed panel, which I have the pleasure of introducing you to. First, we have Paul Carlisle. Paul is the Chief Operating Officer and Market Head of Wintrust Commercial Banking. Paul's responsible for leading and coordinating middle market banking across all the Wintrust banks. And Paul has spent his entire career serving middle market organizations in the greater Chicago area. He joined Wintrust in 2010, and prior to that, spent over 25 years with J.P. Morgan Chase and its predecessor banks, American National and Bank One. Paul is also a longtime member of MPC's board and also a trusted advisor to our work. Welcome, Paul. Alden Loury is Senior Editor of the Race, Class, and Communities Desk at WBEZ, Chicago's NPR member station. Alden leads a team of 5 reporters on the desk, which provides enterprise reporting on race, class, inequity, housing, immigration, neighborhoods, and employment. Previously, Alden has held roles as a research director, policy analyst, lobbyist, investigative reporter, and editor. He has examined population loss, demographic shifts, job trends, racial segregation, mortgage lending, jury selection, arrest and conviction rates, patronage hiring, campaign finance expenditures, ward remapping, and government waste. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Alden is my former colleague from UPC, who was one of the key architects of the Cost of Segregation study. Welcome, Alden.
Thanks, Kendra. Good to be with you.
You too. And Nadia Quarles is joining us. Nadia is the Assistant Vice President for Business Diversity at the University of Chicago. She's responsible for implementing procedures throughout the university to help create the university's contractual relationships with qualified minority and women-owned businesses, primarily within the goods, general services, and professional services industries. Nadia advises university leadership on executive strategies to partner with local and national business leaders, civic leaders, and elected officials to ensure that the university has access to the most diverse talent in the marketplace. Welcome, Nadia.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I'm excited to jump into this conversation. Before I do, I just wanted to provide a little bit of background on the cost of segregation. So in 2017, MPC released a cost of segregation study, which sought to answer the question, what does it cost us to live so separately by income and by race? There were a couple of key findings from this study, which in the findings from the study really began to reveal the structural inequities that are costing us dearly. Those findings included lost income, 4.4 billion annually, lost lives, a 30% higher homicide rate for our region, and lost potential, over 80,000 less college graduates. And today in 2020, we see how COVID-19 and ongoing social injustice has further laid bare these inequities. This afternoon, we'll have opportunity to really lean into these issues and talk about how we can move forward. So first question for the panel. I know we've been thinking as we've been going through this pandemic and kind of thinking about what recovery would look like. There's been a lot of conversations on what returning to normal would look like. But I'd ask you guys to think about, rather than working to returning to normal, decision makers, I think, should leverage this moment as an opportunity to reimagine a thriving and inclusive region. So how can we harness the creativity and the innovation, particularly when we think about the private sector, to not only recover, but to move forward towards a more equitable future? So whoever wants to start with that.
Well,
Sure, I'll start.
Okay.
Okay. Nadia, go ahead.
Okay. So you're right. Things are changing, and corporations and educational institutions have to think about, the way that we're doing business. We have to make a similar shift that a lot of, small businesses are having to make. And one of the things that I think about with that question is something that John Rogers has been speaking a lot about lately, and he's been talking about things from three perspectives, and that's procurement, people, and philanthropy. And so how can we now and I think that that's a great roadmap for all of us now going forward, right? So if we're looking at our procurement, we're procuring things very differently now. So a lot of us are working from home. We're not at our corporation. So a lot of what I like to call kind of low-hanging fruit opportunities for businesses where we were maybe utilizing a lot of catering services because we're eating so much in our offices, and we're doing a lot of printing and those types of things. We're not necessarily doing that, or we're not doing it in the same ways. So we have to make that shift. And one of the areas where I think businesses can make, a huge impact within our somewhat segregated communities is by looking at how are we doing business now. A lot of that business is being done, actually, it's really being done through professional services, right? So we have, let's say, for example, now everything we're doing now is virtual. We're all on Zoom. We're trying to figure, all this out. Our companies are having to make a shift. Well, who are we hiring for those opportunities, right? What type of IT services are we looking at? Legal services, in terms of, we've been talking a lot about various immigration types of issues. We could be hiring, minority and women-owned law firms. Our HR, we're doing things a lot differently with our employees. When you even think about that, even our minority employees, our Black employees right now are stressed, like we're hurting. So how are our organizations engaging diverse businesses that can do some of the D&I consulting work that we need, or some health and wellness things that we need for our diverse staff? So I think Communications, we're communicating differently. We could be hiring minority and women-owned businesses for those areas. So I think in terms of our procurement, as we are making that shift, that we also make that shift to minority businesses who live in these majority minority communities that are going to go back and invest in those communities. And then so quickly, people, when we're looking at people, right? How are we hiring? How are we looking to hire a more diversified, group of employees? How are we diversifying and making our boards not only more diverse, but more inclusive? Making people on our boards feel like they actually have a voice, and people on those boards actually using their voices to institute change, especially now, and talking about, issues around equity. One of the things that we do at the University of Chicago, we look to hire people within the community. So we have like 9 zip codes, and we look to hire people from the community within those zip codes. With our, when we're looking at our construction opportunities, we have an inclusive construction initiative. And so we have goals around hiring people from the community on our construction projects. And then the third thing was his philanthropy, and just looking at, don't just give money to organizations, right? But also, how can you be investing, in these diverse communities besides just donating money, in addition to donating money?
Great.
I know it was a long answer, but it was a good
long answer, but it was a good answer. And I love the framework of procurement, people, and philanthropy. Paul, I know you wanted to get in on this question too.
Sure, and from my perspective, one of the really interesting findings of the cost of segregation study, and one that I think everyone on this call should be aware of, and that is the cost of segregation, our cost of being so separated in Chicagoland versus most other major metropolitan areas in the United States. That isn't just felt in the segregated neighborhoods in primarily minority areas. It's felt across the economy and by all of the participants. And keeping that in mind is important in terms of informing where we go with this going forward, and the incentive that we all have to create a more equitable community, because it is a case where a rising tide will lift all boats. Now, if I was focused, Nadia talked about the procurement side. I was thinking more from the customer side. This is a time coming out of this that finding new markets and new customers should be a real incentive for businesses to reach out to communities across Chicagoland. It's good PR, and I think we found that. I think that when we talk about what we're doing for underserved communities, I think potential customers and existing customers in other markets see that, and I think it enhances the reputation of an organization when they're truly out there serving all of their market. So as we come out of this, I think that as businesses look toward serving all communities in the greater Chicago area, that's going to benefit not only the segregated communities, but all communities across Chicagoland.
Great point, Paul. Just understanding who your customers are and how to better serve them no matter where they're living. Alden, did you have thoughts on this question?
Yes, I think one of the key takeaways for me from the pandemic, and I think about both the pandemic, but also kind of this awakening, if you will, although certainly many of us have been very present to the kind of conditions of inequity and inequality that have existed for decades, for centuries actually. But I think the pandemic has laid bare a lot of things that some of us have known very well. I think when there are moments where we are all impacted, at least to some degree equally. I mean, we've all been impacted by the pandemic, no matter what income level you're in, education level. So everybody's lives have been changed. In the same way that more than a decade ago, everyone's lives were changed in some form or fashion with the recession. These are really opportunities for us to take stock of why, when we are all impacted, some of us are impacted more deeply. And the pandemic is another example, particularly of lower income, particularly of African American and Latinos in particular, from a racial ethnic standpoint, have been impacted more greatly. And really taking an opportunity to dig into why, and understanding that there are some very structural reasons as to why there are disparate impacts when things like this happen. But there are also some choices that we make or that we don't make, which exacerbate the inequities that have always existed. And for the private sector in particular, I think these moments should be an awakening that they aren't just bystanders. They are active participants, either by their actions or their inaction. And so I think it's a moment for folks to take stock of how have we contributed to this? What is it that we're doing or that we're not doing? And there needs to be some very deliberate actions to address the inequality that's out there. And so what those things are, I think, depends on the industry, depends on the company, but there should be an awakening to the fact that we are all active participants in this, and that we have a role to play in addressing it and figuring out exactly what those steps and measures may be that we have taken that have contributed to this, and that we can perhaps undo to remedy the situation, or at least to help remedy the situation.
Yeah. You know, I appreciate the awakening framing. When I think about some of the work of the cost study, I think a lot of that was how do we kind of awaken folks to some of these issues, particularly where segregation has helped create these incredible disparities. And one of those areas has been in the racial wealth gap. So when you consider lending, you know, particularly in African American neighborhoods, you know, how lending is done, and it really contributes to, in a lot of ways, to how wealth is built or how wealth is not built for people in those communities. So Alden, you know, WBEZ recently did an extensive research and reporting on where banks make investments and where they don't make investments. Can you talk a bit about what you discovered and how it connects to the disparities that we see today?
Sure. So Linda Lutton led this project for us, worked along with Andrew Fan from City Bureau, and I assisted them with data analysis and editing. But essentially, we took a look at 7 years worth of Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data provided by the federal government from 2012 through 2018. And we wanted to look explicitly, or specifically, I should say, at home purchase loans. And we really wanted to find a, you know, kind of like one number that embodied the level of investment that banks and other lending institutions were making with regard to the purchase of homes, of single family homes, apartment buildings, you name it, whether it was for occupancy or investment or what have you. Just we wanted a catch-all figure to measure the amount of investment toward home purchases that were being made by these institutions. And so we looked at the data that way. We didn't drill down to looking at individuals. We just wanted to know what amount of money these banks are lending. And so we looked at those 7 years worth of data in the city of Chicago, the census tracts that make up the city of Chicago. And what we found was very wide gaps in the amount of lending, home purchase lending to white neighborhoods, majority white census tracts compared with majority Black and majority Latino census tracts. Generally speaking, overall, there was about an 8-to-1 disparity, slightly less for whites to Latinos, but 8-to-1 for whites to Black areas, 8 times more lending in majority white areas over that 7-year period. And we're talking about $57 billion in all, over 170 or close to 170,000 loans administered during that time. And when we looked at some of the largest lenders, and there we're talking about your Bank of America's, your Wintrust, your Chase banks, folks of that caliber, we were finding, at least for some of them, even wider gaps. In the case of Chase, their lending in majority white census tracts was 40 times more than it was and they're lending in majority Black census tracts. And so we talked to a bunch of people about what were some of the reasons for this. And we heard a gamut of things. You know, there's a difference in values in majority white areas. The property is just essentially going to be valued more. But even with that being said, we also found that there was just far more lending taking place in there. There is a depressed market, particularly in majority Black areas and to a lesser extent in majority Latino areas. And there's a function of our segregation that plays a role in that. I think even harkening back to the research we did for the Cost of Segregation project, we found that areas particularly of African-American poverty were areas that were just literally locked in. These were the places that were the least likely to change. They were the least likely to draw investments. And that reality was confirmed by this analysis as well. You had places like Inglewood that were literally seeing a handful of loans from each institution over this 7-year period. Even places like Chatham, you know, this historic middle-class Black neighborhood, when it became all Black, 1960s, 1970s, it was literally one of the most economically stable Black spaces in Chicago. And it has fallen to some degree on its economic scale. And part of the reason is because it is no longer drawing investments from banks. Chatham itself was getting only a handful of loans from some of these institutions. Some of these neighborhoods were still recovering from the recession. And again, that is a structural matter, but it is also a matter that is based upon the actual choices that institutions were making. At the same time, we were seeing companies pulling out of neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods. One famous example, Target, building stores on the north side while they were also closing stores on the south side. And so the historic trend that we've seen over and over again was continuing in this data, just kind of reaffirmed that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those highlights, Alden. And Paul, we know from this research that financial institutions need to be a bigger part of the solutions. We could talk a long time about like the implications of where they haven't, you know, maybe stepped to the plate, but I want to talk a little bit more about solutions. So how are financial institutions thinking differently as to how to address these gaps? You know, what have been the conversations in light of some of these inequities coming to a head?
Well, I think the key word is proactivity here. You know, traditionally banks have, even those, you know, with a sense of goodwill, have sat back and thought, hey, we have really good mortgage products, or we're a strong small business lender. Businesses and individuals will find us. And you really have to rethink how you're doing business, and you need to address that a lot of customers in these areas will not come and find us. We have to find them. And you have to be in the community, either with a brick and mortar presence, a branch, whatever, or with an active calling program, or both. An example of, a recent example of, I think, this concept of being proactive is the Paycheck Protection Program. Wintrust, as well as some of our other local competitors here, we actively reached out to small businesses, minority businesses, and those in disadvantaged census tracts, checking to see if they had an interest in the PPP loans. If they did, assisting them to apply. And I know from our experience that there's something in the neighborhood of between 1,000 and 2,000 loans that otherwise probably would have been made without us proactively reaching out and seeing if people wanted to participate in the program. It wasn't enough to sit back and say, you know, we're out there, we're available, call us if we can help. We felt like reaching out through community organizations and directly through our branches, we were able to generate some additional PPP loans otherwise wouldn't have been made, and certainly preserved some businesses and deferred or delayed some layoffs that may have happened otherwise. So I think that's an example of something that has to be replicated over and over. Financial literacy is another area where Wintrust and others have been active. You have to make an assumption that not everyone knows how to use a bank. Not everyone is familiar with, you know, personal or small business financial management. And along the lines of what Nadia mentioned before, it's not just donating the money, it's providing programs, volunteers, getting out in the community, if you will, not just handing out fish, but teaching people to fish so that they could be your better customers, understand the financial system, and have access to opportunities that they wouldn't if they hadn't been involved in that kind of education. And you have to find ways to actually lend the money into the communities, even if in the early stages it doesn't, the economic sense may not be there. And there's the regulation that's out there that mandates that banks and other organizations, financial services, play a role in all the communities that they serve. But there also has to be a want to associated with that as well, and a desire to say that if we're going to truly be Chicago's bank, we're going to be Chicago's bank for all neighborhoods. So it's a combination of getting out there, being proactive, and honestly, odd perhaps for a banker to say this, but the regulation helps. Not all of this would be done strictly out of a sense of goodwill. There has to be a stick, if you will, that says if you don't do what you're supposed to do in terms of serving your communities, then bad things may happen to you.
Yeah, Paul, I'm also thinking, how are you guys thinking how engagement, being in community, financial education, how does that look different during a time where, most people aren't walking into their neighborhood branches, because of health concerns? How are you thinking about taking that to a virtual format or just different ways of engaging people during this time?
Well, honestly, I wish we could bring Cassandra back, because she would know exactly what we're doing in terms of delivering that virtually. But I think just like everything else going on right now, we've moved to sessions like this one, where we're spreading the word virtually, spreading it through Zoom calls and GoToMeeting, and reaching out in that way, where our traditional face-to-face interaction just unfortunately is for a time period here has been suspended.
Yeah, I think it's also sometimes you just have to go back to like what you used to do before we had all this technology, calling people up and reaching out and maintaining those relationships. I think is super important. So shifting
There's
a
no
little
question that picking up the phone is key.
Yep. Because a lot of this work is very relational and about the relationships that you have and maintain and foster at the community level. So Nadia, anchor institutions, or universities, hospitals, and other enduring organizations that play a vital role, particularly in local communities within the economies, and they often have deep roots in communities that span decades, sometimes even longer. When we think about making commitments in disinvested communities, that doesn't always show a quick return. It often requires a patient capital. So Nadia, what might be the anchor institution role in rebuilding with a new framework, particularly when you think about the focus on equity and redefining a conversation about risk?
Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting question, because I don't know that, I don't think we necessarily have to rebuild. I think that we just have to do it. And I think that there are, a lot of, University of Chicago, we sit in a community that's, majority, minority, but there are other entities, right, that can be considered as anchor institutions. There, the corporations, foundations, and if you're not doing something, within the community, that's helping to, create more, economic empowerment within our communities, then now's the time to start doing it. And I think that, we have a lot of entities that give, now I'm starting to even hear, as I've been doing a lot of talking to different people, and everyone has an excuse now. I mean, small businesses are having to shift, and they are, suffering. Corporations are pulling back on, on how they're spending, right? And so, but we can't use that as an excuse, because this is also a time for us to thrive and to use some of that diverse innovation that exists in our communities. And so I have to go back to what I was saying before about procurement, looking at how we can expand and do things differently, start procuring things differently. So for some of our very small local businesses, the holidays are coming up. So we're all going to be giving, I know corporations are going to be giving corporate gifts. Let's think about how we can use some of our small local businesses and, procure items from them for, for some of our local giving, and utilizing, firms that do promotional items and utilizing, those businesses for that. Let's think about how we can start ordering, catering services and, food from some of our local businesses. So I think there are more ways in which we can be an economic anchor within our communities. One of the things that we did during the beginning of COVID was the university did a lot to help our local businesses within, I spoke about the surrounding 9 zip codes. And so we gave, for the businesses that were, I wrote down some numbers, for the businesses that were within like our Hyde Park community, we gave out emergency bridge grants to, well, not only Hyde Park, our other communities. We gave out grants to 182 Southside small businesses. That was $680,000 worth of grants to those businesses to help them thrive. We gave rent subsidies to our Hyde Park businesses that were in some of our, office buildings or our affiliates buildings. We gave, we worked with the Greater Chicago Food Depository, and we gave out meals, like hundreds, thousands of meals to the community. So I don't necessarily think that we have to rebuild things that we're doing. We just have to start doing these things, right? And that goes to what I was saying about kind of the philanthropy. As an anchor institution, we can give money, to organizations, and we do that a lot, but we also try to find ways that we can, help people on the ground in ways where it's instant, right? So you were saying, how can we do things now? I think some of those things that I mentioned are ways that, we can do things now. So let's think about how we can work with some of these small businesses over the upcoming holidays. Let's think about, how we can, help provide meals to, to people in these local communities. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks, Nadia. We're going to open things up for questions in a moment. So if you have a question, make sure you put your question in the Q&A box. But before we transition to audience questions, I did want to give Alden and Paul an opportunity to weigh in if you guys have thoughts or responses, as we're in these uncertain times where companies have to be thoughtful of the bottom line and how to tighten the belt. How can we still be committed to equitable investment?
I would say, quite simply, being accountable to the notion of making sure that the outcomes that are produced are equitable. In the midst of the unrest following the police killing of George Floyd, we saw companies, Fortune 500 companies across the board, issuing statements about their commitment to racial equity. And I don't challenge the sincerity of those statements at all. But if you are to look at the board memberships, if you are to look at the economic investments that those companies have made, if you are to look at the staffing of those companies, you won't find such a warm and fuzzy picture of a commitment to racial equity. And so the sincerity of the statements and the social justice commitment rang beautifully in what was put out. But being accountable to those words, being accountable to those values is what truly matters. And so if you are paying close enough to your business operations, to the people that you're serving, to the quality of service that you're putting out, you should have an awareness of whether or not you are falling short of those idealistic statements in the actual work that you do. And if you are, whether you're in lending or you're making widgets or beanie babies or whatever the case might be accountable to those words. And so a lending institution should not be satisfied with only 8% of their lending going to Black neighborhoods. They should not be satisfied knowing that they lent more money in one majority white neighborhood, Lincoln Park or Lakeview, than they did in all of Chicago's majority Black census tracts combined. That can't be okay. And once you acknowledge that and you are accountable to that, you then dig in and say, what are we not doing? And the philanthropic work, the work to shore up inequities or deficiencies that we know exist in terms of financial literacy and other things like that, just to stick with this example of lending, is great. But if you look closely enough, you will also find instances where you are failing with folks that you should not be failing with. Black borrowers who are very well versed in financial services have all of the T's crossed and the I's dotted, and their application still gets denied, or their home is still undervalued in an appraisal. If you look closely enough, you can find some very key areas where you are falling short. And I know that they can find them because we found them in our reporting, and researchers have found them in other avenues. So I would say being truly committed to those words and those statements in your normal course of operations is a key way to come out of this pandemic, thinking more precisely around equity.
It's a great segue, I think, to my next question, which is the audience question, which is really about internal diversity, equity, and inclusion practices and how organizations can really strengthen their work internally. And I know Paul and Nadia, you guys both have experience in this with the large organizations that you're a part of. So the question is, does enacting diversity, equity, and inclusion practices within the organization always require external support and resources? Can some of this work be done internally?
Well, that's interesting. I think, as I noted before, sometimes an external stimulus to move forward in this area is necessary. And as Alden mentioned, you've got to have a commitment to it. And but once you have that commitment in place, and you develop the internal practices to move forward on things like our internship program, which moved from being basically a program for customers, kids, and other types of referrals, to a program that we utilized heavily to attract minority students to sample commercial banking, which we like to think is fun, and that folks might not know that without actually participating in the business. We've utilized that internship program to build a pipeline of more diverse candidates, more diverse bankers over time, and that group has become our primary source for hiring our people into our new banking training program.
Are there any resources that you, Paul, or Nadia, or Alden would point out for this group of where they can get started?
So resources in terms of D&I or?
Yes.
So I just wanted to mention something about the internal D&I. I think a lot of organizations have internal resource groups that I know at the university, at the medical center, we have some resource groups that are built around, there's a Latino resource group, African American resource group, just various resource groups where we have a lot of dialogue about diversity and inclusion. We have a diversity and inclusion council that crosses everyone within the institution. So it's the academic side, it's the administrative side, and we come together and we've discussed issues relating internally to diversity and inclusion and how we can solve problems from students, down to staff. So I think things can be done internally. I do think it helps to hire a consultant to have, just to have a deeper dive into those conversations. Resources, I can give you a list of some great D&I companies, some firms that are here in Chicago. They do great work. So you can send me an email and I'll send you those companies. And then, in terms of businesses, there's the Chicago Minority Supplier Development Council, the Women's Business Development Center. There's the National Association for Securities Professionals that can connect you to minority businesses within money management and financial services. There's the Business Leadership Council. I mean, there's a host of entities around Chicago that can help with, I'm always talking about businesses, but they can help connect you to diverse businesses. But again, if you want to know specifically about D&I, mean, anybody can email me and I can give you some resources for that as well.
Yeah, and perhaps there's a follow-up email to this webinar where we can send out some of those resources as well. Another question related to internal D&I and how to apply that is, looks like some folks are doing some work, but they're interested in what are the best ways to measure progress? How do we know when we're kind of moving the needle on this is a question.
Well, I would say one way is to, at the outset, really kind of talk very explicitly about what your goals are. What is it that you want to achieve, and making sure those goals are things that are measurable. And that kind of gives you a benchmark to think about in terms of, okay, is this success? Are we getting towards it? So on and so forth. I'd also want to just kind of piggyback on the last question and just say that I think there very clearly is certainly an internal aspect to DE&I work. But I think there's also an external part to that also. And one of the ways, our blind spots, I think, particularly in the private sector, is around this notion of who we're serving. And there are ways in which the DE&I work that you do internally can help expose blind spots to the way you approach your work externally in terms of who you're serving, how you're serving, and the amount of resources that you put into those services depending on where you are working with your customer base. And so there are, I think, assumptions that are made or misperceptions that are made based upon the zip code of the geographic area that is being served. And those can be so off in particular instances that this DE&I work that you might expose some of those internal feelings, you can maybe begin to see how they are impacting the work that you do externally that may even be costing you something on your bottom line. And the things that we document in the cost of segregation and other analyses, I think, are indicative of how that mindset bleeds into the ways in which the private sector actually does business in the real world.
Yeah. Great. Paul, I have a question for you. You mentioned in your earlier comments about kind of having this financial institutions having the stick, which we're assuming you're talking about the Community Reinvestment Act. How is Wintrust advocating at the federal level to strengthen that legislation?
Well, honestly, I don't know what we are doing in terms of legislative support. I think that what we have found is that the Community Reinvestment Act, among other acts, Fair Lending Act and others, they point the banks in the right direction. You know, they point the banks in the right direction, and they punish us and others, financial service organizations, if we don't move forward on that. But in terms of what we're doing beyond what exists today, I don't have any knowledge of that.
Okay, great. One question for the group from the audience is, how can nonprofits and for-profits work together to strengthen mission and purpose as they strive towards equity? So I know we talk about this sometimes in the not-for-profit space and the for-profit space, but how do we bring those two spaces together to work more collaboratively towards equity?
Well,
No,
go ahead.
please go ahead, Nadia. No, please.
I was just thinking that, you know, oftentimes what I see around Chicago is we're all doing a lot of the same things. You know, everyone is, you know, there are so many programs and everyone's doing a lot of the same things. I think there are a few organizations that are trying to come together and bring everyone together so we as a group can be more targeted and more focused together. I think that's something that needs to happen. It's like everyone is, you know, we're all double doing things. And so if we could, you know, come together and say, okay, you know, we're all committed to, this group is committed to, you know, doing a deep dive within the community, and you pull in all those corporations and foundations that are doing that work. And these entities are really interested in engaging in, you know, small and local businesses, and you pull all those businesses in. I'm kind of seeing that, you know, around the city, but I think we can do more of kind of coming together and working as a group instead of everyone separately doing all the same things.
And Alden, you were saying?
Yeah, I think there's a potential, you know, kind of symbiotic thing that can happen between for-profits and nonprofits in this way. For one, the nonprofits are probably have longer history of thinking about racial equity in their work. The very services that they provide may be deeply rooted in this notion of equality, of equity. And so there may be a sense of sensibility about the way that they go about their work that can actually be very helpful for profits that really want to begin to think more directly about equity. And by the same point, for-profit companies, institutions are probably resourced or may be providing resources that very much may be in need for the communities that are being served by nonprofits. And there could be a partnership or some type of relationship developed that can allow for those nonprofits in the services that they provide to the communities they're working with, and having a better understanding of how the resources that they're in need of are actually being generated or provided by partners in the for-profit world. And so there are things that they can learn from one another. For nonprofits sometimes are very willing and able and passionate about their work, but they lack a lot of the kind of real world business savvy that is necessary to understand how you actually transfer resources from one space to another. And they can be enlightened in the way that they can maybe help for-profit institutions enlighten themselves about thinking about equity, about, you know, operating with a racial equity lens, things along those lines that can be helpful for their pursuits of equity within their doors.
Right, it's a really good idea. So we are in a moment of raising awareness, you know, around these types of challenges around inequity, around race. I'm curious to hear from all of you how your organizations have been leaning into these difficult conversations in this moment. So I think that's the first question is, how have you in your organizations been leaning into these difficult conversations around race and equity? And I think the second part of this question is, as we think about the role of the private sector, we think about large corporations, how can we continue, or how can large corporations continue to move those conversations forward?
Well, I think to a great extent, it's a big part of it is leading by example. I think the companies that are active, that are in the communities, that are encouraging their employees to be active, I think those companies need to continue to move in that direction, and will hopefully lead others to follow them. I think it's critical that companies that are doing that type of thing, that they tell people what they're doing. I think that's good business to publicize that. But again, it's part of leading by example. And it's focusing on the long-term benefits of expanding the market, not only on a micro sense for the new customers and that you can build as an organization, but in a way then that you can expand that you can participate in the Chicagoland economy as a whole, benefiting from a wider participation by everyone.
And are there specific ways, Paul, at Wintrust, you guys have been leaning into some of these difficult conversations that you want to talk about?
Well, I think the conversations that I've been most involved in are just direct conversations about how we need to create a more diverse workforce over time, and that we need to over time have a banker corps that looks like the full community, and the best way to do that is to start at the beginning and to build a pipeline that will eventually put us in a position to have bankers that look like the community that we want to serve, which is all of the Chicago market.
Yeah. Nadia, how about you Chicago?
So for us, we've been having these conversations on a consistent basis. I mean, now the difference is we're moving them to Zoom, but our conversations have been spanning from, conversations around diversity and equity regarding our students and issues around race with our students. So we're having kind of town halls and conversations via Zoom around those issues, and then the same thing with, the administration side. So I don't think that, anything has changed regarding the fact that we are constantly having these conversations. I do think, though, that, and I mentioned this before, employees, a lot of employees, employees of color in particular, Black employees are stressed right now. There's a lot that's going on, within the communities. And I know I had a conversation with Derek Douglas, who's my boss, and he was saying that, people have called him up just to say, hey, how are you doing? And I think just acknowledging right now that these are stressful times, for people, and just to have, individual conversations, like the conversations around race and equity don't always have to be, these group conversations, but picking up the phone and calling one of your colleagues and just saying, how are you doing right now? Like, that makes a huge difference. And I just think that we need to be more conscious of how individuals are feeling and coping during these times.
Yeah, definitely. Alden, what's the environment?
Sure. You know, what we're doing is kind of diving into DE&I work. We've been doing a little bit of it since I arrived a little more than 2 years ago. So we're really trying to deepen that work. We've created a staff-led committee, nearly 24 staffers who are gotten some consulting work in terms of thinking about how we as a staff-led committee do this work, essentially leading the organization through DE&I training and other things related to that, taking stock of where we are on a number of key metrics. We haven't yet set goals, but we will be doing that pretty soon. I think one of the things that we've been thinking about in this work, and I would encourage every institution, particularly larger workplaces, to undergo this work. Nadia speaks to the struggles of Black employees during this time. I think you can go into any workspace and talk to workers of color, particularly African-American employees, and they will tell you horror stories about their experiences in that workplace or in other workplaces. None of us are immune to our nation's struggles with race. And it happens in our communities, and it certainly happens in our workplaces as well. And it can have an incredibly dramatic impact on the overall quality of the experience that workers, particularly workers of color, have, and also on their productivity. If you're thinking about this from a bottom line standpoint, there are a lot of very good people who have been burned out or stressed out of places because they felt underappreciated, they felt overworked, they felt undercompensated, or they just dealt with microaggressions all day, every day, and it just drove them away. So those are the kinds of conversations we're trying to have in our shop. Where have we as an institution missed things? Where have we perhaps not treated workers of color fairly, not heard their voices, not given them the opportunity to grow? We often don't learn about those things until after people have left. They mention it to a coworker that they left behind. They mention it during an exit interview. We want to have those conversations in the moment and make some adjustments so that we keep good people and have an overall better experience for our workers. And I'd imagine that every workplace needs to have those kinds of examinations.
I appreciate that, Alden. We've been having similar conversations at MPC and trying to make space for colleagues within the organization to have places where they can go and places where they can kind of refresh and kind of dig into these issues a little bit deeper and recharge. And I think that's a huge part of it. One of the things that we've also been talking about a lot internally is, our role is kind of a not-for-profit convener, is how do we use this opportunity to build towards collective action? So how do we broker more relationships between the private sector and the not-for-profit sector and philanthropy to really work towards an equitable future? And I think we've been encouraged by some things that we've seen that's come out recently, the Corporate Coalition and Together We Rise initiative that was announced by Chicago Community Trust. But in our last minute, I guess if you had a sage word of wisdom to the 140 so people on this call in moving, towards working more collectively, what would your one word of wisdom be to our corporate friends who are on this call and thinking about moving towards an equitable future?
If I could say 2 words, I would say
we've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go. And but the commitment cannot waver.
And Alden, your 2 words?
Yeah, sorry, Paul, didn't mean to step on you there. I would say dig in. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be quick. It's going to be hard. It's going to be challenging, but it's long overdue. And I think the results will be well worth the pain and the difficulties. But dig in. It's difficult work, but it must be done.
And Nadia, your 1 or 2 words?
It's hard for me to just use 2 words. No excuses.
Great. That's awesome. Well, thank you all, Paul, Nadia, Alden. It's been a pleasure having this time with you. I want to also thank the Executive Club for hosting this lunchtime conversation. I hope this was a great use of your lunch hour, and we look forward, hopefully, to seeing you in future conversations with the Executive Club. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.